Chapter 12 discusses culture and context, theory and practice. And in fact, it does a really good job of how you connect theory and practice and how the espoused theory isn't always the theory in action and what's taking place. But they also put this and discuss this in the idea of culture, putting that theory into context. And this is actually a pretty nice continuation from chapter 1, as it kind of continues around that idea of what it is, what's that theoretical way of learning or knowing that we talk about in today's adult learner. So what they define first off is culture, and I like this definition. It's quoted from the text, and it's from Shine 2004. A pattern of shared basic assumptions that was learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration. So here's this group of shared basic assumptions that has worked well enough to be considered valued and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. And so when you say something is related and is cultural, that is because that group has a different way of looking at, or a different set of assumptions for that way of looking something it's external or internal, and they have a different value that's been placed upon it. So read that a few times over until you have it in your mind that those cultures have worked through those things over a long period of time to determine which is the correct way to, in their minds, the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. A couple of other terms that are real important here. Positionality and privilege. Social and cultural forces shape the access to power and privilege. And I think if you've not heard of this terminology, you might want to review it each time that you read it and really understand what the differences are here. But social and cultural forces, they shape who has power and who has privileges in a particular society. They give you a lot of good examples. And they talk about positionality. And just to be clear, positionality isn't your position on something. Positionality is rather how you view or perceive, or the lens that you have about something based on experience and based on your privilege and based on your access to power that you have because of particular things that they note here, visible or invisible attributes such as your ableness, your age, your class, your culture, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, language, etc. You bring a perception or way of looking at things because of the culture that you're in, because the gender that you have, because of the race that you've been born with, the religion that you have. You have a position on a particular topic, or the way you look at something and the way that you evaluate or judge something. Privilege is another concept that they talk about in this text, and they don't belabor it, but they give you some really, I think you should really ponder it and reflect what they say about it. But privilege is unearned power based on race, gender, class, or another positionality. In other words, maybe just because you're a position and you have a multiple groupings up here that are considered powerful kinds of positions, those have become privileged. And they give you a nice chart at the end of the text to look at what you think you might have as privileged. Maybe I'm privileged gender-wise over somebody else who might be in our particular society that might be African American, it's woman. And so it talks about marginalized populations. It talks about how those tend to impact the way that adults might learn or the way they might perceive in a learning situation. So privilege is another concept discussed in this chapter that's takeaway. They ask several really good questions, and you should pause and reflect on these. I don't ask all of them. In fact, there's so much good content that I really struggled figuring out a discussion question on this topic. So I asked you to give me an example of a concept or something that resonated with you in this chapter and why. So be looking for that as you reflect on some of these comments or questions that they pose. But one of the questions is, how has your positionality and privilege affected your participation in education and learning? How has it enabled you to engage in that type of learning? And I think that that is a very good question as you look back at what privileges you have and your positionality, your position, where your point of view might be coming from, is related to your education and your learning. And in fact, here's the chart that they present at the end of the chapter. These are actually several questions that you can reflect upon and might cause you to think about what was the most important concept in the chapter. But what is your culture? What is your positionality? Where do you fall in here? What gives you privilege in the world? Are there Are there privileges to Caucasians or white people above anybody else in other cultures? And I think that there's quite a bit of research on this topic to say yes, there is. Does gender impact that? In some cultures, maybe females have more power, they have more privilege inside of their particular culture, and in others, less so. In fact, probably most of the world would be less so. What makes you marginalized in this world? Are you a woman? That might be one marginalization. Are you from a race that's not part of the culture where you live? Maybe you are, for example, maybe you're a Chinese person who is living in Japan. You would be definitely marginalized in that culture. What makes you marginalized in the world, if anything? And quite honestly, I took a qualitative research class where there's a lot of dialogue about being white, male, Caucasian, and a certain socioeconomic status that really puts you at the top of the food chain. And we had a conversation in a course about, gosh, then why are there so many troubled souls that fit that they have all this power and privilege? What is it in their world that keeps them from being able to be successful? And it was a really interesting conversation about not folks who necessarily didn't have power and privilege, but those who did and still didn't succeed. Anyway, very interesting conversation. Lastly, how has your positionality and privilege affected your participation in education and learning? Again, going back to that positionality, has it impacted where it is that you might be, where it was that you were able to go to school and that sort of thing? Context, that's the second concept that they really talk about in this chapter. And context in adult education has been equated with history and the culture of the learner. In other words, where is it you come from? In this case, they're going to talk about the context for where you're learning, but also bringing together that cultural piece about what your attitudes might be around what's important to learn and who knows things, who knows more, who's smarter, what is best for that particular culture, what is the way of knowing that really is going to make you revered or give you a position that is more privileged in a position of power. And talk about this in terms of East and Western traditions. Keep in mind that power is associated with your positionality and privilege. You have power when you have a position that's in that culture that is more revered or set above, and that gives you certain privileges in that particular culture. Culture and learning. Epistemological systems, and I've talked about this in other courses, but epistemological systems is something they mention. Remember that an epistemology or the epistemology is a theory of knowledge, our way of knowing and how we come to know. That is what that study is. What is that theory of knowledge? What is it? How do we know what we know? Our way of knowing and how we come to know is epistemology. And so you put those two things together, and sometimes we say that a person who's more knowledgeable, they know more, but that's viewed differently depending on the culture that you're coming from. Learning from experience is common in all cultures, but is less valued in the West, where formal book knowledge predominates. In other words, if you have that certificate or that degree, or you can present yourself as having this particular credential, that's really valued, or you've passed this many tests, or you have this highest score. Whereas in other cultures, primarily not Western cultures, Eastern cultures, Asian cultures, learning from experience is common, and that is actually valued at a different level than we have in the West. They spent a few pages talking about this, give some nice references back to Confucius and different types of, in a cultural context, points of view. And non-Western views of lifelong learning are situated in community-based, informal learning that is grounded in Buddhist principles and mindfulness. Mindfulness. It's actually something that's been emerging in the literature, and it really goes back to reflective kinds of learning. It's intentionally attending to our daily life. African values of the village and other cultural holistic views of learning, transformational, experiential, social, spiritual, those different kinds of learning are highly valued in other cultures, but they're not something that we measure and tick off particular and say that this is knowledge. We think that this is valued in different cultures. Not saying one is good or bad, just that they're different. And we have to recognize that, especially when we come into educational settings where we have people from different cultural values, and maybe in the case of a student, they're from a cultural value that is different. and yet you're trying to get them into a particular this Western culture here, and their parents don't understand, or they don't understand why you are valuing this one item where they think something else is far more important. Maybe it's their community or their mindfulness or their being together, whatever it might be. That's more important to them based on their culture. Now, the next topic in the chapter talks about culturally relevant teaching, and that means that we are sensitive and that we have an understanding and that we blend together the best of both worlds, if you will, the knowledge, the specific things that we want to have, and we put them together with an understanding and reflecting piece that's acting on that learning. And in fact, your text quotes Confucius and mentions that he believed that learning, thinking, and acting should go hand in hand for a complete education. That's that Eastern tradition, that it's not just about the facts and then kind of take the test. I don't really need to think about it. I don't need to even act upon it. I just got to pass it off, and that's good enough for the learning. He believed that we needed thinking and acting together with that. Kolb comes along, I believe in the 50s or 60s, and this was actually published a little bit later in 1984. He's still alive today. He must be 70 some years of age. But and we'll talk more about him when we get to experiential learning, which is in chapter 6. He actually puts this together and says, yes, there's a merging of cultural practices to achieve learning, that it can't be just learning for what it is. And especially with adult learners, it's not just a collection of facts. They're coming and they are motivated to learn by being able to do and achieve. They're coming there for something very specific. They're not being there to just be fed and check off the boxes, so to speak. So he adds experiencing. They're going to be a concrete experience. Then there's the reflecting, or coming back to the thinking part here, and putting, reflecting and thinking together, and then the application or the acting. So he brings together this Eastern tradition with this Western ideal of let's put together a learning cycle that is actually much more reflective about how adults learn. So I think that this is a model that still could be applied and is applied in secondary and post-secondary settings, and we'll discuss that more when we get to chapter 6. Regard for the learner and the context for the content. That's really important with adult education, and sometimes discounted because in formal education especially, we have C standards. Folks are going to meet these standards, and that's what's going to be checked off at the end of the day. Some of them might include experiences and thinking and applying, but some of them don't. What Kolb is saying and what this chapter is talking about is that we have regard for that learner. We take that experience into account. We put it within that context and we add it to the content. That content is inclusive of what that adult knows. That experience is inclusive of what it is that we're trying to teach and learn about. So as you're looking at this chapter, you should be taking away what really resonates with you, and that's what's going to be part of the discussion, and that's what we'll talk about as part 2 of the questions in the discussion this week.